Okay, all of you. This video is going to be based on this comment here by Indigo XYZ18. There was also another person by the name of Nobody000 who made a very similar comment about. So what this person could predict in 2020s in this decade, he feels that we may see the death of game consoles as we know them, game consoles, and I kind of agree with that because all the games would probably be a part of streaming service like Netflix, and then 5G wireless technology will allow for data transfer speeds that will allow for cloud computing. Yeah, I mean, I could probably believe in that. I mean, you can imagine, that it could take place, to take the place of computing hardware such as consoles or PCs, cloud computing, yeah, I mean, I could probably imagine that. All computing will be mobile, so long as you have a connection to the internet, all your programs will run on the cloud, like we currently store data, cloud data,
This year it's not just another Christmas rushing by so fast. This year it's not just another Christmas turned into Christmas past. This year I found out the truth about Christmas. It can't be bought in a store. This year for me there's a meaning to Christmas. Its meaning so much more. Hosanna in the highest, the King of Kings has come. Hosanna in the highest, glory, glory to the Son. This year when I hear the Christmas carols, I'll know just what they mean. This year it's more than just chestnuts roasting and plastic manger scenes. This year I've seen that the birth in the stable brought forth a Savior for me. This year he's filled up my life with his presence. It moves me to my knees. Hosanna in the highest, the King of Kings has come. Hosanna in the highest, glory, glory to the Son. And this year I want to give love. This year I'll give of myself. He gave it for free when he gave it to me. So this year I want to give. This year I want to give love. This year I'll give of myself. He gave it for free when he gave it to me. So this year I want to give. This year I want to give love. This year Jesus has come. He said, "Hosanna in the highest, glory to the Son." Hosanna in the highest, the King of Kings has come. Hosanna in the highest.
Hi YouTubers, this is Gil. So let's talk about this. What do you guys think that the new decade or this decade will bring us? I know that person made some pretty wild predictions there, and I could probably I can agree with some of that, It's hard to know, but we could talk about this, and I would probably base this video on me living in California and also basing on how things evolved, so to speak, in the last 30 years. So put it this way, for the case of the camcorder and the cell phone, let's put this for the example and perspective. So my camcorder, like 30 years ago or in 1988, the camcorder was like a big, bulky, shoulder-mounted camera on my shoulder and everything, and it used cassettes, used the cassettes. And then it took, like, say, 10 more years later, they were still doing those, right? They were still doing those camcorders that you put on your shoulder, but although they had fewer of them, they were doing the smaller versions of the 8 millimeters and stuff. They did that. But, I mean, they still had those analog camcorders going all the way 10 years after 88. And then, they first started doing digital camcorders going on to like the early 2000s, but they were still tapes. They were still driven by tapes, or they had tapes in them. And these digital cameras were mini DV, as we probably know it. I had a mini DV, so 10 more years later, from 1998, from my first camcorder, so making it 20 years later, what they had was like, that's where they first started doing memory card camcorders, or that's when they first did an HD camcorder. And I got my first memory card camcorder, and this is talking about 20 years later, so I was doing tapes. I was using a tape camcorder for 20 years after 1988, and it's just in the last 10 years where everything's really changed, because I got my first memory card camcorder in 2008, and I was using that camcorder only for a few years, and then I pretty much replaced that camcorder rather quickly with a phone, because phones started recording in good enough quality for me to go ahead and replace the camcorder altogether. And this was back in 2011, not even 10 years ago. And since then, I've been using my phone for my camcorder for the most part, well, except for any professionals, like, for me, this is for me though, for what I use it. So that's how camcorders, for this example, evolved. So, I mean, for 20 years, I was using tapes, so you could see that it didn't evolve that quickly in the first 20 years of the last 30 years, but in the last 10 years, everything evolved really quickly, as we could see, because I was using the memory card camcorder for just a few years, and then suddenly I started using the cell phone, because... Okay, so let's just talk about phones for a bit. So imagine, in the 80s, that's when, I don't know if they had cell phones before the 80s, but I do know like the 80s was around the time when they first started that I know of, but there are these bulky devices. And then imagine, so 1980s, that was only 30 years ago, in the 30-year range, 35-year range, in the third decade range. That's when cell phones started coming out, right? And then you figure, like, going on to the 90s, we still really didn't have a feasible priced cell phone, and it didn't come until going towards the end of 90s. So like going on to 1999 is where, the first feasible priced phones came out, but they were just basic touch well, they were not touch screens, but they were just push button phones. It was just basic push button phones. And so you figure, and then going on to the like early 2000s, that's when they started doing color screens on the phones. And then going on to middle 2000s, that's when you first started seeing the internet phones, like the Blackberries. I know, like around there, it was somewhere around that time that I can remember of. I remember and then going on to the middle 2000s, it was when they started doing the internet phones, like Blackberries and stuff. And then the color screens were very sophisticated, or became sophisticated around that, and that's only 15 years ago. And then going on to like more like into the middle 2000s, going towards the late, I think 2007 maybe, is when the iPhone first came out, if I remember. And that was like the first official touchscreen phone. That's when everything started being touchscreen. And this was only from 2007 or so, and maybe I don't know exactly when they first came out, but I do know, well, touchscreens, but I do know like it was only from the date of this video, it's only like 15 years ago that this came out, you know, the touchscreen stuff. Imagine that, like only 15 years ago that they first came up with these touchscreen phones, and 100 years ago, it was not gonna be until 70 more years before you would see the first cell phone. So imagine that, you know, or like going on to 1900, it was not gonna be until like 80 years later that you're not gonna see the first cell phone, you know, and then going on to like and then going on to the early 2010s, that's when they started doing HD cameras on the phones, and like where and then the photos were now good enough quality to go ahead and replace your cameras with their phones. It was only in the last 10 years that we were able to almost officially replace the camcorder or the the cameras with your phone, you know, like where the average consumer would just use their phone. Only 10 years ago, you can use your phone for everything. It's only 10 years ago. So imagine 30 years ago, you had to have a separate camcorder or separate camera or separate calculator, whatever. 30 years ago with these cell phones, but 20 years ago, you were able to eliminate like the calculator, things like that. But only 10 years ago, it's only 10 years ago in the last 100 years that, that you're able to replace everything with your phone, and that's only 10 years. So now imagine that. You imagine that, so you picture that, and then now, how do we picture how all this stuff is gonna go from here on to the next 30 years? You know, what do we think what things will be like 30 years from now? But you know, now if we're gonna talk about like talk about what I think and what do you guys think is gonna this decade is gonna bring us? What do you guys think? But in my opinion, only and basing on where I live, California, and basing on how I witnessed things evolving over the last 3 decades. So I would say what do I think what I think will change or what will evolve, so to speak, in this decade. I would think that one thing for sure, I would think that one out of four cars by the end of the decade, this decade, or the 2020s decade. I think by the end of this decade, one out of four cars is going to be electric powered, and this is in California, basing it on California though. So I would think that's one. Number two, for about cars again, it's gonna get to the point, or it's gonna be pretty much getting to the point where us normal consumers are not gonna be able to work on our own cars anymore. Not like in the old days when we were able to work on our cars by ourselves and it would not upset the computer systems or the setups on the car, or affecting the ability to pass the smog and all that crap, you know, that we have in today's cars. But like in today's cars, you know, like you cannot really alter much in today's cars because it's going to upset the settings on the computer and all the data on the car, and then it's going to cause a lot of problems, and you're not going to even be able to pass the smog and stuff. For an example, I heard on one of Scotty Kilmer's videos, like where someone tried to replace an engine on a Toyota Corolla, like it was probably like a 2004 or something, and he tried to replace it with the engine that's the same engine, but from a different year of Toyota Corolla, and then it would not run anymore after it would not start after he replaced the engine. But him coming from a car that was 3 years newer, but it's the same engine, right? So and then Scotty Kilmer says that it's because of the way the computers are set up, or electronics on the cars are set up, it has to be very precisely that engine from that year of car, because over a couple of years or so they always change something, and it's like when they change something, you really cannot like how evade those little changes, like little changes that they make in today's cars. For an example, you cannot evade it. You really cannot evade that. Not like in the old cars, like in the 80s. Like if you had an engine to replace on an 80s car, you could replace it with an engine that's a few years newer, and you could do that, and it's not a problem. But in today's cars, you can't do such a thing. But in talking about today's cars, I feel that with the way they're building cars these days, and all the electronics that are all the controlling the engine and everything, all the electronics on the car, it's going to get to the point where, I mean, we're not going to even be able to work on our own cars anymore. We're not going to even be able to fix the car ourselves, because these days, I would think by the end of this decade, it's going to get to the point where you have no choice but to take it to a dealer to fix a car, because only the dealer will have the equipment that's going to be required to work on these cars today. That, like, where, I mean, like how they're making it a little overly complicated, and it's getting to the point where you need special equipment, and no average consumer is going to be able to do that on his own. He's not going to be able to fix cars on his own anymore. Now, if I would be talking about, let's say, what the YouTuber predicted being the death of the consoles, I could probably believe in that. Where pretty soon, like you'll buy a little console or something, and then it's like everything will be downloaded these days. Like, it's not gonna have any physical. I feel like it's getting to the point where, I mean, today, and in today's times, everybody's like pretty much downloading games these days, because it's just convenient, to do such a thing. It's not. We're not gonna. I mean, pretty soon that's gonna be totally gone. Like where it's gonna get to the point where they're not gonna have any physical copies of games, for that example. They're not gonna have any physical. There's not gonna be any such thing. And even the consoles themselves, yeah, you could probably imagine, like they'll probably have like something that you could download on your TV or something. They'll have TVs. I would wonder what the TVs will carry. I would imagine TVs will have like a processor built into them where you could download a game console on your TV or something, and then yeah, I can imagine. And then if you buy a new TV, you could transfer the console. So I can imagine things like that happening. Pretty soon, I would imagine the TVs is gonna have like a built-in computer in there where you could do like those certain things, like watching the YouTube or Netflix, and everything will be all cloud-based, like the YouTuber explained. It sounds pretty accurate there. I mean, that's my take on that part. But now, if I was predicting what's gonna happen by the end of this decade, I can imagine what things will look like 30 years from now. I mean, 'cause like 30 years ago, I was using this big bulky camcorder, and everything was very simple. But now, 30 years later, look at where we're at now. I complain about like how things are today as far as like the complication of stuff, but I'm able to bear with it. I mean, I guess. We still have our game consoles, but it's not the same as the ones from 30 years ago, for that example. And the camcorder, I'm using my phone at this moment for my camcorder. And like these days, we don't. It's like a camcorder is not even in my vocabulary, because I'm using my phone typically. But of course, I like to buy other camcorders. Like in this case, I bought a GoPro 8, so I can use that for. Sometimes we still gotta buy it. Some of us professionals will still prefer to use like a separate camcorder, and yes, and I do that too. But so the continuation of what I see, that I think that we're gonna see by the end of this decade, is that we're probably gonna be seeing a lot of these things. Like they have these right now. They currently have these Google glasses or something. Like it's like regular eyeglasses, but it's like has like a little screen in it, and you could do things kind of like what you can do with your iWatch or your watch or Apple Watch. It's like I don't know how that works. I don't know how these little these glasses work, but it's like a glasses. It's gonna be able to do some of the things that your phone can do, and that even includes making videos and pictures through your eyeglasses. Yes, I mean I've seen that, you know. And then that's what's coming out, and I would probably think they're gonna come up with an eyeglasses phone one day or something like that, and I can probably imagine that you're gonna be doing everything on your eyeglasses. And for all I know, they're probably gonna do it contact lenses, computers or something. You know, just don't know, man. I can imagine. Don't be surprised that they're gonna do such a thing like that. You know, I know that they already have these eyeglasses cameras and stuff. They actually do have Google. I don't know what they call those. Google glasses or something. It's like something that it's kind of like what you could do with your iWatch, and you Bluetooth it to your phone or something. I'm guessing. I know that those are probably gonna become more sophisticated in the next, like in this next decade or this decade. You know, so I can imagine by the end of this decade, I think that it's probably going to be maybe they're going to start replacing the phone with something else now. Like maybe your watch will become your phone, and then you could call somebody using your glasses or something, and then you could talk using your glasses. I mean, I can imagine, you know, I can imagine that they're going to start doing that by the end of this decade. You know, but the phones will probably be replaced with something else, and for all we know, do you think that how will they change? If I thought that for 10 years, I can imagine what things will look like 30 years from now. They'll probably have an implant on they'll probably have a chip implant or something on your skin 30 years from now, like where you could do all your calls on that chip in your skin, you know, who knows, you know, I mean, that's pretty scary there. I mean, I don't know, it's just crazy. I just think of it as crazy to think that way. I know if we're gonna talk about 30 years from now, probably every person that's born, maybe they're gonna put a chip on them or something, and then they're gonna use they're gonna use all the technology to be able to track that person for when they need to. You know, every person is gonna have a chip put in them. I can imagine, like 30 years from now, that it's gonna be the start of doing that. I mean, I don't know, man, but I just know that it makes me wonder if I would want to go through that or not. I'm talking about go through the next 30 years because technology changes so quick. I mean, it's just only in the last 10 years that technology has really gone to the max. You know, like it's now to the point where I mean the computers cannot go any faster, and then what can they create any faster these days? You know, or for that example. But if we're just talking about the for this decade, if I'm talking about this decade, I know that overall I would feel like 1 out of 4 cars in California is going to be electric powered. That's my take. And then I mean I would probably think about like something about they're going to start doing something with the TVs where they're going to have a built-in computer on it where you could download a console or something, a game console or something, you know, kind of like the program where you can use a computer built into your TV, you know, because you know, like you figure, computers are like built into a PlayStation, you know, like things are just gonna get better over time, so it's gonna be small enough. The circuit boards with the highest speed possible, or like the processing boards that they have in all of these game systems, they'll probably be able to fit them on the TV, like where it's gonna come standard. That's my imagination. What they're gonna start coming up with in the next 10 years, and then not along with the glasses, the Google glasses that I would think is gonna start replacing the cell phones one day, like where you're not gonna have anything, like where you don't even have to carry anything in your hand. Or maybe they're gonna do contact lenses. That yeah, I mean, just don't know, man. Like, or I mean, that's that, man. That's my take. And then about the cars, yeah, like I was thinking that by the end of this decade, I would predict that it's just gonna get to the point where we're not gonna be able to work on our own cars anymore. We're not gonna be able to work on our cars because of how overly complicated and how overly sophisticated technology is in today's cars. You know, it's gonna get to the point where we regular consumers are not gonna be able to work on our cars, on our own cars anymore. Not like the '80s, like where we had our Camaro, '68 Camaro, and we would be able to do anything we want, and it would not harm the car. It would not upset anything. It would, if anything, the car would like it when you when you work on it, you know. But in today's cars, they sure don't like it when you try to modify something in today's cars, you know. One other thing that I could point out too is that, you know, these days if we everything's just been making us lazier over the last years. You know, and it's just only in the last, say, 15 years that everything boomed up. You know, like Facebook and YouTube and everything that we could do on the internet today. This only was made available only just in the last, say, 15 years ago. But going back to 20 years ago from today, going on to like the 2000s, like the beginning of 2000, I mean, people did have computers and internet, but it's not nearly as widespread as it is right now. Not like the way it was, but it just boomed up. The internet use just boomed up just only in the last 10, 15 years only, you know, because the cell phones, it just boomed up. The ability to do everything on the cell phone had just began only like 15 years ago. Because going on to the 2000s, we had cell phones, but they didn't have internet. It was not until going on to the mid 2000s. So everything boomed up with being able to do everything on the cell phone, on just a cell phone, in the last 15 years. It's only been in the last 15 years. So imagine that, 15 years out of like since 1900. You know, you figure it's just only in the last 15 years that it really seriously boomed up with the cell phone use and stuff. Only in the last 15 years, like dating back to 1900, let's say. Because imagine in 1900, it was going to be another 80 years before we're going to see the first cell phone, you know. And then imagine what did we do all those 80 years? I mean, we lived in the same way, but it's just only in the last 30 years. And that's pretty miraculous, or that's pretty quick, you know. That's very quick, you know, like 30 years. I mean, it took only 30 years out of the last 100 or even 1,000 years. Only 30 years for all this to evolve so quickly like that. And look how far we got in just even in the last 10 years, you know. I mean, but I mean, speaking of that, you know, like I just know that in today's times, in the last 15 years, you know, like all the Facebook and stuff and all the things that we can do with the tap of our fingers on our phones, it's just making us more lazier these days. Because instead of going outside, we could just go to our Facebook and chat with somebody on Facebook or FaceTime or whatever. I mean, that's pretty bad, you know. That could be sad because we miss the old days when we used to just actually go out to meet everybody, like as a gathering, you know. Like it's like these days it's not as much of that these days, but I'm sure there's people doing it right now. But I mean, it's less of it in the general, for the general person that I know of. You know, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I do know it's just making us more lazier for the normal person, like even me myself. I'm guilty of this myself, so I mean, it tends to make me lazy myself with all the new technology that we have today, that was available only 15 years ago, versus like it was not nothing like this available 20 years ago or even 30 years ago. Imagine we didn't have all this dating passing 1980. You know, like imagine that. So what? If I thought this was a controversy, I would call it, if I would explain it. What would things be like by the end of this decade, and what will things be like even going on to the end of the century, you know, or in the next 30 years, you know? So, what do you guys think? What? So I'm gonna leave it all to you guys to comment below there what you guys think, how things will look like by the end of this decade. What do you guys think? That this is video is basically about my take and my opinion only, and basing it on living in California. Yeah, and still one more thing to point out too is like I do know like in the last 30 years, like we we had a lot fewer people living on the planet from the last time I read, like going on to 1900. The number of people living on the planet was somewhere around like less than 2 billion that I read somewhere. Correct me if I'm wrong. But in today's time, in today, 2020, from what I heard, the population had boomed up to about 7 million now in the planet. So if that was 2020, I think in the last just 30 years, it boomed up a billion people in the planet or something. So imagine 30 more years, it's gonna be even more people living on the planet. And then in my town, I think it's gonna be even more people than how many there is right now in my area or in the LA area, where pretty close to where I live. I can imagine what things will be like 30 years from now. I mean, in terms for how many people is gonna be living on the planet. So there you have it. So you leave a comment on what you guys think. So okay, I hope you like this video, and I hope I didn't bore you with this one. Alrighty. You guys gotta check this out. This, according to this, the world population was around 1600, 1,600,000 people, or a billion and a half, going dating back to 1900. And then if you scroll up to like even going on to like 1950, around 1950, it only went up a billion people, like in 1950. So it's only 2.5 billion people. And then if you go to like 1980 or 1960, I would say they went up only to 3 billion. And then according to this, going on to 1970, it went up to 3.5 billion, or a little over that. And then going on to 1980, 4.5. And then going on to 30 years ago, it was 5 million or 5 billion people dating about 30 years ago. But now, in today's times, it's close to 8 billion right now. Well, it's approaching 8 billion people right now. I mean, in 2020, tell you, it grew really fast from only the last 100 years. Only 100 years. Only in the last 100 years it grew this quick. Very fast. Just in the last 100 years it grew so quick. Yeah.